All right, so welcome back. My name is Michael Dreesen. I'm a professor at John Cabot University. I also am the director of the Rome Summer Seminars on Religion and Global Politics. So many of the students that you see here, hope that you've gotten to know them a little bit. Hopefully they'll come and say hi to you, but they're here for 2 weeks working on PhD projects at the intersection of religion and global politics. And a number of them are working on religious freedom issues. So I'm excited to hear what they have to say about this conference. Yeah, welcome. And we welcome your questions. So this panel 3, is called an Interreligious Conversation, Integral Human Development, Human Dignity, and Religious Freedom. And just as a way of introduction, some of the conversations so far in the conference, but also emerging in the literature on religion and the Sustainable Development Goals, which is an emerging subfield within political science, global affairs, have called for the need for better or more effective multi-religious collaboration and from the ground up. On this panel, we want to begin a conversation about that. This interreligious conversation, calling on this really wonderful group of actors who have been deeply involved in interreligious activity, interreligious engagement, interreligious scholarship over the last decades. Now, as Catherine began to note in the last panel, interreligious dialogue, the approach of interreligious dialogue has sometimes been in tension with the approach of religious freedom. Sometimes it's been a little bit of a different focus, a little different group of actors. Interreligious dialogue has tried to really take seriously what Professor Ferrari was speaking about this morning, about the multiple soils and multiple religious traditions of different places, and think about the possibility of multi-religious cooperation and religious engagement between them. So this panel, we want to have a little bit of a conversation putting some of those pieces together: interreligious dialogue, interreligious engagement and conversation, religious freedom and conversation with human dignity, and ask this esteemed panel of experts to help us to reflect on what we've learned over the last couple of decades of their work on interreligious collaboration, about religious freedom as a shared concept, as a shared value, including a theological value, as in the concept note states, and as a goal, as a basis or not, for multi-religious cooperation, for building flourishing and peaceful societies. To what extent does this interreligious collaboration on religious freedom offer a foundation for multi-religious cooperation on human development? So with that, I'm going to go down our row of scholars here. I'm going to try to keep them to 7 minutes so we can have a nice conversation. This is meant to be a little more dynamic as an exercise, and we'll be inviting your questions shortly. So start off here with Brett Scharffs, who's the Rex E. Lee Chair and Professor of Law at Brigham Young University in the U.S. and has been working on these issues for many, many years. Thank you, Brett.
Thanks. Heartfelt thanks to Fabio Petito and all the organizers for this fantastic event. Archbishop Gallagher began this morning by emphasizing the importance of the Vatican II document, Dignitatis Humanae. Speaking not as a Catholic, but as a Christian, Dignitatis Humanae is by far the most powerful statement in the world about the deep connection between human dignity and religious freedom. I want to just highlight a couple sentences from it. It begins, "A sense of the dignity of the human person has been impressing itself more and more deeply on the consciousness of contemporary man, and the demand is increasingly made that men should act on their own judgment, enjoying and making use of a responsible freedom, not driven by coercion, but motivated by a sense of duty." The second major section begins with this: "This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits." The Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. The document then goes on to say that this freedom does not result in anything goes or indifferentism. Rather, it creates a duty on the part of us as human beings to seek the truth and then to live according to the truth as we understand it. I view today's gathering as an opportunity to reflect on the deep connections between human dignity and integral human development. As the concept note for this conference states, immediately following the quotation of Pope Francis's United Nations speech on the Sustainable Development Goals, quote, "Integral human development is a holistic model of human flourishing rooted in the inherent dignity of each person and every person." And so we might say that human dignity is the foundational concept of both religious freedom and integral human development. I might prefer to visualize the relationship somewhat differently, with human dignity, religious freedom, and integral human development positioned around a circle with a virtuous influence of each concept on the others that is mutual, reciprocal, and bidirectional. My primary headline recommendation from today's launch of this new global platform would be to center the promotion of integral human development on human dignity in a way that is analogous to the centering of the Church's defense of religious freedom on human dignity. At our center, the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, for the last 6 years or so, our experience has been to focus promoting freedom of religion or belief with human dignity at the center of that promotion. This has manifested itself in a variety of things, including the Punta del Este Declaration on Human Dignity for Everyone Everywhere, as well as human dignity initiatives on African perspectives on human dignity, which just resulted in a published book, on Asian perspectives on human dignity, a book in process, Islamic perspectives on human dignity, and just last month we held a conference on Oceania and Oceanian perspectives on human dignity. Also this month was published a new book on judicial uses of human dignity, and a special issue of the Review of Faith and International Affairs recently featured the findings from a conference we held at Oxford last summer on the founding figures of human dignity, where each of the drafters of the primary drafters of the UDHR, we had a chapter talking about their personal views of human dignity. Focusing on these conceptions of human dignity, I suggest, may be more powerful and effective in promoting integral human development than Western conceptions of human dignity, such as those of Immanuel Kant. Now, I want to focus for just 2 minutes on the word integral, which to my ear is the most distinctive part of integral human development. As I see it, there are 2 dimensions of the meaning of this word. One is something is integral if it is fundamental and necessary in order for something to be complete. And so the idea, I think, is that in order for human development to be whole, complete, and unified, it needs to pay attention to things like religious freedom, human dignity, the other things identified by Pope Francis in his United Nations address. A second meaning of integral denotes wholeness or completeness. Even I remember my mathematics that integers were whole numbers, and there was something powerful about the concept of an integer. Perhaps the goal of religious freedom and the goal of integral human development is that we might live what Harvard Law professor Ruth Okedji recently called a fully integrated life. Integrity, after all, derives from the Latin integritas, meaning one or whole. BYU law professor Justin Collings recently wrote, A life of integrity is a harmonious whole. A life without integrity is a life divided. A life of fractions, divisions, and is, I can't read my own handwriting, and is discordant. As Silvio Ferrari noted this morning, religious freedom is an instrumental good. None of us, I think, would want to belong to the Church of Religious Freedom, or for that matter, to the Church of Human Dignity or Integral Human Development. But religious freedom and human dignity are important, even if they are not what we ultimately value most. They are prerequisites for seeking and striving after what we do truly and deeply value. The goal, I would suggest, of religious freedom and integral human development is, at least in one way of putting it, to help us as human beings to live a fully integrated life. As Professor Ruth Okeji put it, the dignity of our person is affected by all the spheres of life, whether you're at work, whether we're having fun, whether we are in school learning, whether we're worshiping in church, whether our worship is internal or external. We are fully integrated across spheres. And so, my recommendations are two. The first is that in our discussions of integral human development, we focus on human dignity and let it have the same animating power that it has had in discussions of religious freedom, going back to Dignitatis Humanae. And the second is to really exploit, in a good way, the presence of this incredibly evocative word, integral, and to tie it to the idea of wholeness, completeness, of necessary parts, but also to the goal that we want people to be able to live integrated, whole lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brett. Thank you also for staying with the time, but thank you for bringing our focus on your good work on human dignity and the importance of integralism within it, so thank you. Sharon Rosen, who is our next speaker. Sharon Rosen is the Global Director for Religious Engagement at Search for Common Ground, and she is based in Jerusalem, Israel. Thank you, Sharon, for being with us.
It's really a pleasure to be with you all. The Declaration on Human Fraternity was promulgated and signed by a Christian and a Muslim. And although I'm part of a non-faith-based organization, and this has actually proved an asset when advancing religious freedom around the world, we have 90 offices across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. As this session has been called an interreligious conversation, I thought first to expand the message of the Declaration beyond Christian and Muslim sources as an observant Jew living in Jerusalem. The Hebrew Bible's vision of social justice flows from its teaching regarding the sanctity of all human life and its inalienable dignity. In the words of Rabbi Tanhuma, if you curse or despise anyone, quote, know who it is whom you despise or curse, for in the image of God he created him. Therefore, the Mishnah commentary on the Bible declares that each person is a whole world and unique, and thus he who destroys the life of one person, it is as if he has destroyed the whole world. And he who saves the life of one person, it's as if he has saved the whole world. I'm sure Muslims in the audience recognize that as well as part of their faith. For the same reason, the Mishnah states, none should consider him or herself to be superior to another. There is a discussion in our text by two of our greatest ancient rabbis on what is the most important precept in Judaism. One said, love your neighbor as yourself. The other said, all human beings are created in the divine image. And that could perhaps be an answer to whether the focus needs to be on your society first, your own, or as we heard in China, or on the individual. Because God is merciful, the Torah indicates the divine, as it were, is biased towards the vulnerable. And precisely because we are called upon to affirm the dignity of all, we're required to pay special attention and concern to those whose dignity is vulnerable or marginalized: the poor, the stranger, the widow and orphan, the minorities in our midst. The Torah is accordingly replete with commandments regarding our ethical responsibilities towards the vulnerable in society. The Talmud notes that the obligation to care for the stranger or sojourner is repeated 36 times throughout our sacred texts, more than any other commandment. Judaism accordingly requires its adherents to contribute to at least a tenth of their disposable income to those in need in the context of the agrarian economy of that time. And so the Hebrew Bible calls to refrain from reaping the corners of your fields, to leave gleanings for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and stranger. However, at the foundation of these precepts is not only the idea of our social responsibility towards others, and especially the vulnerable, but a dramatic understanding of the nature of property ownership. This is expressed in particular in relation to the biblical sabbatical year, which itself may serve as a model or at least inspiration for collective social responsibility. At its foundation is the declaration in Leviticus, "For the earth is mine, says the Lord, and you are sojourners and tenants with me." Human beings are no more than tenants on God's land. They don't own it, a lesson that religious people, particularly in my part of the world, often forget to our great cost. I found myself nodding in agreement during the introductory panel, which focused on using the term human dignity or integral human development. As I mentioned earlier, and as Brian Grimm reiterated, you speak the language of your target audience. Human dignity resonates so much more than religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief in many countries where we work, where 4/5 of the world have a connection to a religious community. However, there is a caveat. We found that the term human dignity in more secular circles, for example, in the US and in Europe, they push back, saying that human dignity is too vague. It doesn't focus specifically on advancing religious freedom. And I don't think anyone I've spoken to even knows this term, integral human development. So another message of caution to adapt your language to each community. As the Global Director for Religious Engagement at SEARCH, I have become convinced that religious actors have a crucial role to play in not only helping to de-escalate violence and conflict and build peace, but generally to help with the enormous issues we're facing in our modern societies. Issues like climate change, migration, poverty, inequality, refugees, hate speech, and more. Because religion is so maximalist, it covers every aspect of our lives, and it has something to say about everything, and sometimes even more than everything. That's why, to our advantage, if we want to influence for good, particularly when religion is such a key identity marker in so many people's lives, we have to work with religious actors. So I fall on the side of Catherine Marshall when you said earlier that religious engagement isn't only about engaging religious actors on religion, but also on advancing human prosperity, many other things. However, here's another caveat. We must also acknowledge that religious actors can be a weapon of war, not just a force for human development and prosperity. So how do we deal with that? We need the following. We need an intra-religious, an inter-religious, and then an extra-religious, or let me call it a multi-sectoral approach, in order to have full collaboration. No one sector can do it alone. The problems are made way too great. We need a whole of society approach. Secondly, we need religious literacy. Policymakers need to learn about religion, and religious actors need to learn about other religions and policy, and how to do policy, and how they can advocate authentically. We need inclusion. We need women, men, youth, governments, and we need an intergenerational movement, which I will speak about in a couple of minutes. And we also need capacity training and support of religious actors to competently use their natural influence and the values that they share and their passion for peacemaking to advance human development and prosperity. I have many examples of our work on advancing human dignity around the world, whether it's setting up interreligious freedom roundtables in different countries, which naturally is not called religious freedom in places like Sri Lanka or Uzbekistan. I do want to acknowledge Fatih Hachem. I don't know if he's here, I can't see him, but he was instrumental in helping us to set up the Interreligious Freedom Roundtable in Lebanon. We have a 5-year program in a consortium to advance religious freedom in 7 countries with a focus on women and youth inclusion. And we're part of another 5-year consortium to advance religious and ethnic freedom across Asia. Our initiative in Israel over the past 8 years has engaged Muslim and religious leaders to build constituencies of peace in religious communities in Israel using a religious lens. That's been very challenging, but we are seeing some successes. But I want to finish on one point which I feel very strongly about, and that is an attempt that I'm making personally, but also with InSearch, to create an intergenerational movement for human dignity and to advance thought, conscience, and religion. A lot of people are talking about youth-led movements, but in actual fact, we need that intergenerational aspect where youth can bring their new innovative ideas and thoughts and expressions, but they need to also have discussion with those who have had some experience in this field. And together, perhaps we can make a difference and try and deal with all the tremendous challenges that we have in this world. So it's wonderful to see all the young people here and help us to build up that youth movement, or the intergenerational movement, I should say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for these wonderful comments, also for challenging us a little bit on some of these limits of these concepts, human dignity, and the lengths that they travel or don't travel, and the need for intra-religious conversations about them as well. I'm going to pass over the microphone, so to speak, to Peter Mandaville, who is currently the Senior Advisor for Faith Engagement at the United States Agency for International Development, but also has a long and storied career as a scholar and academic as well. So Peter, we're looking forward to hearing you on these points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking the organizers and particularly our hosts here, the Sovereign Order of Malta. USAID actually signed a memorandum of understanding covering various areas of partnership with the humanitarian wing of the order some years back, so it's a real pleasure to be here again at this amazing building. On the first panel this morning, Scott Appleby intervened briefly to register with this group the idea that when viewed from the vantage point of an institution or organization primarily focused on doing things in the world with respect to the delivery of development and humanitarian services, some of these questions and discussions around religious freedom and integral human development might look somewhat differently. And so what I want to offer is precisely that, the perspective on these issues from where I sit now and in the United States' premier foreign assistance agency, whose primary modality of work is precisely doing things in the world and more specifically providing the resources necessary for crucial humanitarian and development work. And what I want to do is to talk about a couple of different ways that freedom of religion or belief intersect with and is present in the work of USAID. Many of you will, of course, be aware that the primary mandate for the United States government to promote religious freedom around the world comes from the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. And of course, that act created the Office of International Religious Freedom at the U.S. Department of State. And for that reason, the Department of State is really the primary lead for activities around promoting religious freedom in the world. Many of you, of course, know my close friend and colleague, Ambassador Rashad Hussain, who leads that office. Now, international religious freedom is relevant to the work of USAID as well, insofar as we view democracy, rights, and governance work as an integral part of the holistic approach to development that defines the work that we do. There has always, almost since its inception, been some presence of democracy and human rights related work at USAID, but it's usually preceded through the auspices of an office within one of our larger departments or units. Consistent with the Biden-Harris administration's focus on bolstering democracy around the world in the face of unprecedented authoritarianism and democratic backsliding, democracy, rights, and governance work recently got an upgrade at USAID insofar as we now have a dedicated bureau focused on human rights work, and so in that sense, a natural locale from which all human rights issues, including freedom of religion or belief, will naturally have a home. So that upgrade of our rights function more broadly is one way that religious freedom issues are present and part of the work that we do. The second way that religious freedom connects with our work relates to the mandate of the work stream that I lead as the agency's senior advisor for faith in engagement. This work is related more to what Catherine Marshall was talking about earlier as strategic religious engagement, and I hope she won't mind me recognizing her as essentially the matron saint of all of the work that we do. That strategic religious engagement work, which is different, closely related to, but different from advancing religious freedom or from interreligious dialogue, the two kind of existing configurations that Michael referred to at the beginning of this panel. That strategic religious engagement work we view as primarily a partnership function. It's about the ways in which USAID forms partnerships with faith-based organizations in order to implement and advance a full range of development functions and work in the areas of things like public health, education, food security, those direct partnerships with faith organizations to advance humanitarian goals. And it's been part of our work since USAID was established in the 1960s. We've had a standing institutionalized space for doing that work since 2002, when the George W. Bush administration established what is now called the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And I'm delighted that I'm joined in Rome by my colleague Amanda Vigneault, who leads the day-to-day work of that center. The center has been renewed, and this is important, it's been renewed by every administration since, which means that there's a strong bipartisan consensus around the value of incorporating religious engagement into USAID's work. In the Biden-Harris administration, we've taken that commitment to the next level. September of last year, USAID Administrator Samantha Power launched the U.S. government's first ever strategic religious engagement policy within the foreign policy and national security space. It provides a blueprint that makes the case to development professionals that religious engagement and partnership with faith-based actors is relevant and important for accomplishing their existing goals and objectives. It provides a blueprint and principles that guide that work, and those principles directly reference ideas like integrity, respect, and even dignity very directly. The document is available online. I tend to carry physical copies of it everywhere I go so that I can put them in the hands of people, and so we would be more than happy to make sure that you have access to that document. My mandate is primarily around the implementation of that strategic religious engagement policy. And as part of it, we've been doing some thinking about how we should talk, think, and operationalize in our work the relationship between religious freedom and promotion and strategic religious engagement. Because while we do see them as distinct functions, there is a necessary complementary and symbiotic relationship between the two of them. Religious freedom, some basic modicum of religious freedom, is a necessary and obvious prerequisite for successfully realizing the goals of strategic religious engagement, right? If faith-based organizations are working in an environment where their ability, their latitude of maneuver and operation is constrained, then it's just not possible for them to effectively do their work. So we need religious freedom in order to be able to do strategic religious engagement. Conversely, through the partnership that we form with faith-based organizations, we then realize new opportunities for advancing strategic religious engagement. So I want to briefly touch on a few things that USAID has done to more directly support and advance religious freedom, and actually, as it turns out, in integral human development, IHD itself. So in our programmatic work in recent years, we have incorporated activities that are specifically designed to protect and enhance the rights of religious minorities in countries such as Iraq and Myanmar. We have done work around religious pluralism and supporting greater tolerance in countries such as Indonesia. We work closely with colleagues at the U.S. State Department to track and report on the ways in which U.S. foreign assistance funds are specifically deployed to support the rights of religious and ethnic minorities around the world. So it gives us an ability to actually put dollar figures on the level of resources that the U.S. government commits to protecting the rights of religious minorities around the world. Earlier this morning, one of the speakers referred to one of our closest partners, Catholic Relief Services, and the ways in which the IHD model is just sort of essentially part of their operating system in terms of how they do work. So in 2008, Catholic Relief Services published a short book called IHD, A User's Handbook, right? And it was meant to be a practical how-to guide for CRS's own staff as well as their partners about how to reflect and operationalize integral human development in the work that they do. If you scan down the cover of that document, you will see the logo of USAID proudly displayed at the bottom of it. We actually helped to support the production of that book. So we've been directly involved in discussions about and reflections on the relevance of IHD for the work that we do. Finally, our Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships a couple of years ago, and in many ways very much in line with some of the ideas that we heard from Brian Grimm earlier about the important relationship between religious freedom and things like economic openness. We set out to try to establish with some methodological rigor the relationship between religious freedom and various kinds of developmental outcomes. And we thought that this was important because it's easy to suppose or surmise that that relationship is present. It's easy to sort of sit on panels and sort of declare that that's the case, but in resource-scarce environments, and often when we are confronted with colleagues that are sometimes skeptical about the value of religious engagement or religious freedom, you need to be able to show the evidence. You need to be able to make the case. And so we wanted to be able to say that, look, there is distinct added value for development outcomes that we already care about with respect to things like democracy and governance, with respect to things like conflict, peace, and stability, which are the two sectors that this work was organized around. There's distinct added value that accrues from incorporating religious freedom promotion into the work that we do. So we worked with the United States Institute of Peace to conduct that research. The findings are available, and again, we would be more than happy to share them with you. I want to conclude my remarks this afternoon by connecting myself with a chain of conversation that started earlier this morning with some of the insights offered to us by Naz Renea that were, I think, echoed by Professor Silvio Ferrari. We heard it in things that Sharon was saying this morning and just now as well. We heard it from Catherine as well. This idea that while there is universal significance and relevance for work, what it looks like, what's needed, the most appropriate and effective ways to frame it and get at it will often vary significantly from context to context. I think that's relevant to the work that we do at USAID, that insight, for the following reason. If there is one North Star that currently shapes the trajectory and the content increasingly of the work that we do at USAID, it's the idea of locally led development, the localization strategy. We have a document too on that if you want. We have lots of documents. But this approach has three components, one of which is directly relevant to our discussions today. The first piece of this is about changing the way that money flows. It means moving away from a reliance on moving our resources towards large, usually corporate entities that then subaward money to various implementing partners, and focusing more on getting those resources directly into the hands of localized actors on the ground in the countries where we're trying to do our work. The second piece of it is about trying to streamline some of the vast labyrinthine bureaucratic requirements that are associated with trying to do work with a huge bureaucratic entity such as USAID. The third piece of it, I think, is the most difficult, which is not to say that changing the way the money flows and streamlining the requirements aren't difficult themselves, but the third piece of this localization strategy is about trying to make sure that when we design programmatic interventions and work around the world, that we are reflecting the needs, the priorities, the experiences, the worldviews, the values of our partners in those countries in the way that we design and think about the work. And I think that dimension of locally led development, that aspect of localization is directly relevant to discussions and debates about ways of approaching religious freedom and integral human development. So, as you've heard me say, USAID has a long history of partnering with and alongside religious communities and faith-based organizations. And an essential tenet of this mandate, and the reason we're connected all together today, is the promotion and protection of freedom of religion and belief for all people around the world. The ability to worship and to practice one's faith, or no faith at all, or to realize one's conscience in the public square is a fundamental right and a matter of great human dignity. We are committed to these ideas because they reflect not only USAID's principles, but American values as well. Thank you.
Much, Peter. Thank you for sharing with us, and I'm sure we'll have come back to some of those really interesting points on how the U.S. does this. I'm going to pass right on to Richard Sudworth, who is the Secretary for Interreligious Affairs of the Archbishop of Canterbury, based in the UK. So thank you very much, Richard, for joining us.
Great, thank you. I'd like to add my thanks to the organisers for convening this gathering, and particularly to the Sovereign Order of Malta for the hospitality. Mindful, they've made me especially welcome by ensuring that the location is within the sound of the bells of St Anselm, that great doctor of the church and Archbishop of Canterbury. So thank you. What I'm going to endeavour to speak to is across a number of spheres, speaking as somebody in the UK, so I'm going to bring one observation from the UK scene, as a Church of England priest, as part of the Christian church more broadly, and in terms of the international scene within my role. So reflecting on freedom of religion or belief and the interreligious. So I'm going to share just 5 observations, trends, and perhaps some qualifications, challenges, and dare I say it, as someone from the Protestant tradition, or I'd like to say Reformed Catholic, want to really affirm the sort of foundational framing that we had this morning around integral human development. So I'll be making a plug for that in some of my observations. First of all, just to give some of the UK scene, we heard in an earlier session the sense of fear of religion, and paradoxically for someone that's part of an established church, it would be fair to say that foreign policy for many years in the UK has been suspicious of religion. The religious dimension is, well, it's just controversial, we're not going to go there. But pretty much following some of the pattern of the US, there's been an increasing openness, development of a FORB, freedom of religion or belief envoy, and one of my first observation would be that there's suddenly an opening, and I speak now as a Christian observing the global scene where many Christians do not have freedoms around the world, suddenly advocacy groups within the Christian field are finding an open door. And what many may have regarded as the Cinderella human right has to some extent become the golden child. That's where the money is, that's where the attention is. And that's both a good thing, and I would want to suggest has come with some, I would say, some misgivings, because the dangers of sectarianism, of partisanship in advocacy, which ignores the local and the contextual. And this is one way where I'd want to claim for integral human development a truly Catholic, a truly global, universal perspective that rescues us from the partisan, that we cannot afford to just be speaking for our own communities. And following on from that observation, which may or may not be relevant elsewhere, one trend that I observe, which has been another flip side of that innovation of people in the scene increasingly giving voice to government, advocating particularly for Christians, suddenly they're finding their own practice and thinking has had to change. So we are beginning to see unusual bedfellows, and I welcome that. So seeing evangelical Christians in partnership with Muslims in defending the freedom of religion for Christians in Pakistan and partnering in challenging Islamophobia in the UK. So there are unforeseen consequences and things that, dare I say, are absolutely to be welcomed, that reflect something of integral human development, because when you encounter the other in relationship, suddenly your vision is often expanded if you see the human, the dignity of the other. And it's part of the broader sense of geopolitics affecting the local, and certainly at the moment we're seeing the dark side of that. In my country, and I know it's happening elsewhere, what is happening in other countries is prizing people apart in the local. But actually, there's also some flip side to that. So the stories of lack of freedom for Christians in areas of Pakistan are motivating British Muslims in Bradford and Birmingham to stand with Christians and say, we're going to speak to our brothers and sisters in Pakistan and help you. And those things are mirrored in all sorts of ways. So the geopolitics affecting the local for freedom of religion or belief. Another aspect of the unusual bedfellows and the changing scene, and we've not heard it mentioned thus far, is people of faith partnering with atheist and humanist groups. So the freedom to leave religion as a legitimate foundational dignity of freedom of conscience. So seeing conservative evangelical Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus standing with or writing letters together about the need to acknowledge freedom to leave or change religion. So another dimension of shifting integralism, sometimes unanticipated, not necessarily as part of the starting point for groups. So for opening different doors, different unusual bedfellows, trends of geopolitics impacting the local, the conversion or losing religion, freedom to step away from religion being on the agenda. And then in the international scene, we've heard it touched on a number of times already. In my work, working across the Communion and with other faith partners internationally, this task of translation, of context, it is not enough to use the language of the International Human Rights Order, of human dignity necessarily, but explorations that may be in the realm of citizenship, mutuality, of inclusive citizenship. These are all on the table as part of an approach that recognizes that all of us are situated, all of us come with histories, and someone who's white from the UK, from a country that had an empire, for sustainable, credible transformation, none of us can go in wagging the finger. How we listen and find resonances. And again, that will be helpful to me from the prism of integral human development, because it sees the whole person. It sees the culture and the history of partners across different tradition. My fifth point observation, a word that I'm not sure I've heard mentioned today, and forgive me already for using the jargon, intersectionality. This is where integral human development can help us. Where are the women? How do we prioritize and give space for the recognition that, and this was touched on by Peter, there's a mutuality and a mutual informing when we ask questions about interreligious dialogue and where the women, and human development and local actors leading for the good of their communities who are women. And in my world of interreligious relations, one of my kind of little arbitrary observations is how good are local interreligious relations is in any town or city in the UK. One good answer to that is, where are the women in the public spaces for civic interreligious discourse? If they're prominent, chances are there's a really good, strong network across different religions. And you can ask the same of those involved in the development world. And they're not to be separated. So these are indicators that help us. They're the canaries in the mine, or the measures of progress, of advancement in this cause. So there are trends which are challenging, and I guess I want to summarize to some extent what I heard Scott Appleby say around integral human development. All of this is heuristic. We're on this journey, we're in via with an aspiration, and it does mean that bald and imperial notions that work from deficit are not going to be sufficient. So I will, as a Church of England priest, give a big cheer for the Catholic inheritance of integral human development and say, we've got lots of work to carry on doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and for sharing this experience from the UK, but also in dialogue with other religions, very much bringing forward this interreligious dimension to the conversation, so thank you. Our final speaker is Mahan Mirza, who is the Executive Director of the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you, Mahan. Bring us home, so to speak.
Thank you very much. The danger of going last is everything has already been said, but I might surprise you, so wake up. Thanks to the hosts, thanks to the organizers, thanks Fabio, thanks Michael. I'm just going to jump in and tackle a couple of questions that were posed for this panel, and then close with a comment on some of the bigger concerns of this conference. So one question that was posed: are there deeper connections between the practice of interreligious dialogue, collaboration, and encounters, and the recognition that religious freedom is a value? So I'm going to start with the very personal and then go global. So the answer to this question is yes. I could offer countless examples. So I'll settle with an irrefutable but very personal one, and that's me. I'm a Muslim, originally from Pakistan, who traveled to the United States to study as an undergraduate. Despite being fluent in English and having lived in both England and America for a few years in childhood, I experienced a severe culture shock when I arrived. When asked to reflect on a meaningful interfaith encounter later in life, I wrote about an interfaith encounter with America. Because making a home and a life there deeply challenged the worldview I had grown up with. One of the outcomes of my culture shock was deep introspection. I asked myself an elementary question. How could I be concerned for my religious freedom in America, but I couldn't care less about similar freedoms for Hindus, Christians, Shias, and other minorities in Pakistan? A switch flipped. I've witnessed profound transformations in students and others who are guided through even short periods of cross-cultural and interfaith dialogue. So, encounter matters. Another question, can we identify and explore theological trends that prioritize religious freedom? Again, yes. Let me mention 3 trends from a Muslim perspective. First, a generational trend. Just anecdotally, I'm sure there's data out there, just about every American Muslim household has a rebel child who wants to dress, date, and play like other American teenagers. They pay no heed to traditional norms, marry who they want, even choose to leave the faith, and they have a diverse circle of friends. Most importantly, they're good kids. Parents have no choice but to love them and accept their newfound freedoms. So healthy pluralism is driving religious freedom. Secondly, a high-level state-sponsored initiatives like the 2016 Marrakesh Declaration call on jurists trained in the classical tradition all around the world to reverse engineer Islamic thought, to update it, to conform with contemporary human rights norms. The 2019 document on human fraternity, signed by Pope Francis and Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayyib, the head of Al-Azhar, further lends credence to this trend at the highest levels of religious and state authority to advance religious freedom. Thirdly, contemporary Muslim scholars in academic contexts, which are forming a rival center of authority to traditional scholars, are increasingly grappling with the global human rights agenda, both critically and theologically. All this being said, there are also reversals. The rise of populism and religious nationalism threatens progress, as do costly and bloody wars. Many in the global South consider Western promotion of democracy and human rights as an extension of colonialism. The eruption of violence in Israel, Gaza, and the region has brought the tensions between rights and interests, the inadequacy of international institutions, and power imbalances in global governance into sharp relief. The head of Amnesty International recently said, and I quote, "Powerful states are abandoning the founding values of humanity and universality enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This harms religious freedom, the cause of religious freedom." Religious freedom as a concept, largely cultivated in the modern West, also comes with a host of assumptions about the human person and the relationship of that person to the sovereign powers of the state. And we've heard about this today. Pope Paul VI writes, I hope I'm reading this correctly, especially for this audience, but he has written in his encyclical on religious freedom, which we've been hearing about, Dignitatis Humanae, the demand is, so you expand individual freedoms, and the demand is also made that constitutional limits should be set to the powers of government. It's a corollary. So religious freedom here becomes political philosophy or political theology. To put it more plainly, in the words of Governor Mike Huckabee, sorry to have him follow, I believe it's a lot easier to change the Constitution than it would be to change the word of the living God. So religions can be politically subversive. By placing an explicit focus on religious freedom, upholders of human rights in this era of great power rivalry may inadvertently damage their cause by making those on the receiving end nervous about what might really be going on. Are these particulars masquerading as universals? As Silvio Ferrari also said this morning, I just love this, I'm going to memorize it. Religious freedom can't be exported. It can only be cultivated. Enter the SDGs. So I'm moving to the global. A humanitarian agenda that seeks to provide all people with basic needs, eliminate extreme poverty, uplift the socially marginalized, and save the planet's life-giving biodiversity and ecosystems is arguably a better framework for faith-based and interreligious engagement that also advances religious freedom. In 2022, Pope Francis and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew co-authored a foreword to a volume on ethics in action for sustainable development, which examines the role that the world's religions, philosophies from East and West, and indigenous and secular traditions can play to advance the SDG agenda. The SDGs call for a moral economy in which fair distribution and sustainability are prioritized over efficiency and profits. A society in which the dignity of labor, forgiveness from crushing debt, and time for leisure and spiritual growth are privileged over relentless economic growth. A planet in which our kindred species and the air and water that sustain life are protected from extinction and exploitation. The SDG agenda is value-laden. It combines science and spirit, ethics and governance. Religion is nowhere, almost, and it is everywhere. Cooperation for the implementation of the SDGs relies on what Seipel and Hoover call the collaborative capacity of covenantal pluralism. By participating in world-making together, religious actors must better learn to translate their own values and also listen better to understand the values of others in pursuit of the common good. What better mode of encounter could there be? The SDGs prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable. This is quintessential IHD, integral human development. You shall know them by their fruits. Last paragraph. According to Jeffrey Sachs, the editor of the aforementioned, one of the editors, is lead editor of the aforementioned volume on ethics in action with Pope Francis and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. So Sachs says, each generation must offer its own rearticulation of human rights, and the SDGs are our attempt. Dignity as a form of practice, as Nazila Ghania said in her opening remarks. That is the story of religious freedom in the SDGs. It might appear to be nowhere, but it is actually everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mahan. Wonderful group of papers. Now, we're supposed to have a quick, dynamic lightning round of questions between us, and then we're going to open it up for 10 minutes of questions from the group. So I have to ask you all to be very brief in your responses so we can get some questions from the crowd here. So let me just start off with Brett, maybe just two short questions. One, picking up also from this quote, which I think everybody's mentioned from Silvio Ferrari this morning about religious freedom cannot be exported, but only be cultivated. I wonder if you could say something about how your advocacy of human dignity-based approach to promoting religious freedom fits into that claim. And then I want to add a little bit of pepperoncino to the discussion here and just press a little bit on this. I'm also interested very much in the human dignity approach and some of the ambivalences of human dignity today. We heard integral quite a bit, but it was used in different ways. Integral human development and integralism on the part of Richard. So I wonder about the connection between those two. When human dignity gets instrumentalized as a way to reclaim public space for religion and the public sphere. And I think we have this, outside of Rome, we have this the building of this Human Dignity Institute, which was financed by Steve Bannon, who called it a gladiator school for cultural warriors. And I wonder if you see that, some of that instrumentalization, or you worry about it, and if so, how do you respond to it?
All right, thank you. That's a lot to do quickly. As usual, Silvio is right. It is true that it's perhaps impossible, very difficult to export religious freedom, and very important to cultivate it. But Silvio's only partly right. And I can see Silvio in back, so I have already used this line with him, and we'll try to explain what I mean. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has Article 18, which is a very powerful, direct, and succinct articulation of the right to freedom of religion. That has then been turned into an international covenant on civil and political rights, which has been adopted by most of the countries of the world, which creates binding legal obligations of those countries to protect the rights articulated. In addition to that, we have nearly every constitution in the world, the US is an exception, has been adopted since 1948, and virtually all of them incorporate the language of human rights, often quoting or paraphrasing Article 18 in very specific ways. Is that exporting or cultivating? It's an interesting question, but it is legitimate to hold people to account for the solemn covenants they have entered into. And so I think we want to be a little bit careful about saying that this is just Western imperialism, this is just exporting Western values. I've taught religious freedom in some of the difficult places on earth, including China, including Vietnam, including Myanmar, including Indonesia. It's very difficult to find people who say they disagree with Article 18 when you read it to them. When you ask them, do you want to be coerced with respect to religion? Do you want to be forced to believe or not believe? Very few people, I haven't found one yet, frankly, says yes to that. And so I think there is a genuinely universal dimension to human rights, including the right of thought, conscience, and religion. Now, that said, I think it's also very important to look for the seeds that can be cultivated in various places. This is really the animating ambition and idea of our Human Dignity Initiative, which is not to go say, here's what Immanuel Kant taught us about human dignity, but instead to go and say, how do you think about human dignity here in Africa? How do you think about human dignity here in the Muslim world? How do you think about human dignity in Oceania? Do you know how many of the scholars from Oceania felt like they had been listened to on this topic previously? I'm not sure very many. And so that is an effort to develop indigenous concepts and to cultivate them. And what we find is when people care deeply about human dignity, religious freedom in some form of significant manifestation follows. And it isn't imposed, it isn't exported, but it is cultivated. The second question, yes, anything can be instrumentalized. One of the forms of objection to our effort on human dignity for everyone everywhere, one scholar refused to participate because he said, human dignity has been captured by the LGBTQ crowd, there's nothing we can do about it. And others say, human dignity has been captured by the pro-life crowd, there's nothing we can do about it. It is possible to instrumentalize everything, including human dignity. But we've noticed several things. One is conversations rooted in human dignity tend to elevate rather than degrade. It's not inevitable that they elevate rather than degrade, but it's symptomatic of them that they elevate rather than degrade. A second thing we've noticed is they tend to get us thinking about reciprocity pretty quickly. It's easy to talk about my rights versus your rights, but when it comes to human dignity, it's hard to take it seriously and talk about it meaningfully without noticing that it's a feature of others as well as oneself. And so it tends to be generative, it tends to be upward rather than downward in its inclinations, and it tends to be something that is a way of opening doors and starting conversations in places where that could otherwise be difficult. But can it be weaponized? Yes, I'm sure it can.
Thank you very much, Brett. Sharon, a quick question. I was interested in the intergenerational aspect. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, and whether you think it helps overcome some of these limits of the term human dignity. I don't know if that is one method to allow that to travel further.
Just before I answer that question, I do want to, while agreeing with everything you said, Brett, I would wonder whether there would be any possibility of passing the Declaration on Human Rights now in the world. Remember that it happened straight after the Second World War. I think we were all completely shocked by, well, those who are alive, but also afterwards, of what happened, what we did in the world. And the whole setup of the UN and so on happened as a result of that. But there has definitely been a decline in this whole issue of human rights in countries, and also whether there is a legal a law, a universal law or not, has never really worried many countries as to whether they would subscribe, or not subscribe to it, but actually implement it. So that was just a comment in relation to what you said. In terms of the intergenerational movement, we have been looking for a long time to see how we can create a more inclusive approach, including women, including youth, into making changes in our society, developing. I think particularly with regards to the question of freedom of religion or belief, or religious freedom, whichever way you want to call it, human dignity, there has been a movement. We've seen it in the ministerials, the religious freedom ministerials that have taken place. In England, for example, in the UK, we brought young people along. They were parts of side events, talking about their role in the religious freedom ministerial that took place in Prague last year. Those young people were already in the heart of the ministerial. They had their youth panel on the first day. But I would say that those young people need to be in every single panel now, that we don't just have youth panels, but we have a young person who are part of each panel giving their viewpoints, both speaking, expressing what they believe, but also listening to the others. To other people on the panel and the audience, so that they can learn from that. About 6 months ago, an online 25-hour meeting took place for young people on religious freedom that was run using the open space technology. For those who don't know it, it is an opportunity for the people who come to a meeting to actually create their own agenda, to put up the topics that they want to discuss on the market board, as they call it, and people sign up for discussion on it. And we did it for young people across the world. It was actually run by somebody from associated with BYU, but also with the support of EarthBar, with the I never remember exactly what it stands for, but it's the Article 18 Alliance. Yes, that's the easiest way to call it. We had nearly 600 young people joining it in different time zones. They set the agenda, they discussed the issues. I listened in, I was part of the discussion, And it was really exciting to see the enthusiasm, the desire to be part of it. And this is the sort of thing that I think we need to develop across the world, because there are, I think it's something like 2.5 billion young people in the world today under the age of 18. And you can't ignore them anymore. They are the ones who are going to be leading. They are also, around 85% of them in a survey like adults say that they, in a Pew survey, say that they have either a religious or spiritual approach in their lives, and yet the majority of them say they have no faith or trust in institutions, including religious institutions. I think that's a very, very, very important message that we all need to accept and see what we can do about it.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Peter, and I'm going to ask the last three to be very brief in your responses, less than 2 minutes, so we can get at least a couple questions from the crowd. So, wonderful to hear about some of the localization of religious freedom. One of the things that strikes me, in your presentation is, the institutionalization of religious freedom as a foreign policy, over decades, and it's true that there's localization, but there's also remaining suspicion that the U.S. is exporting religious freedom. A very particular understanding of religious freedom. The religious establishment cause is a particular version of religious freedom. So I wonder, over these last couple decades, and maybe particularly over the last few years as you've been more involved, have you seen an evolution in the response to that criticism? How do you deal with that now? And how does that maybe look different from 10 years ago?
Yeah, no, I think there has been an evolution in recent years. You're absolutely right that the promotion of international religious freedom is not something that, for example, the United States Department of State organically decided to begin doing of its own accord. It was a mandate from the United States Congress. But over the years, it has become a well-developed and routinized work, part of the work that the State Department does. We offer required and mandatory training for those State Department officers that are involved in writing the annual reports on international religious freedom around the world. So it certainly has been institutionalized. Now, the nature of religion, the constraints of the Establishment Clause that you mentioned, Michael, do necessarily create certain sorts of complexities, right? Because any time the state gets involved in this work, it means that at some level the state has to be able to start setting boundaries around what does and does not constitute religion, right? And I think some of those kinds of questions are precisely what we're talking about when we're getting into questions about cultivating religious freedom versus exporting religious freedom. There's been an evolution in this space, I think, and I think that the success of the creation of forums such as the International Freedom of Religion and Belief Alliance testifies to this, in that you now have collectivities of states that previously did not have discussions about this issue, talking about it together. And even if they come at it from slightly different histories, inevitably different cultures, different starting points, we are able to usually use that space to begin to synchronize and harmonize the way we talk about it. It's also become possible, and this is a huge change. When you think of the evolving bilateral relationship between the United States and a country like Saudi Arabia, right? Religious freedom was often a difficult conversation to have with the government of Saudi Arabia, and we now have questions relating to tolerance, the coexistence of people of different faiths that are voluntarily put onto high-level agendas by our partners in Saudi Arabia itself. So there absolutely has been an important change here.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thanks for the brief. Yes, Richard, quick question on the... I like very much some of these, the ways in which you're describing these positive experiences of interreligious engagement in the UK, and also the way in which you brought gender into it. So I just want to push you slightly on that. Some ways in which we talk about the difference between interreligious dialogue approach and religious freedom approach is protecting religious difference, something that dialogue sometimes does, versus protecting religious freedom, the ability to change one's individual religious. And so it was interesting that, these interreligious experiences, Muslims, Jews, Sikhs coming together, lined up well, in your view, with a very positive gender aspect. I wonder, was that always the case, or did you see that in tension sometimes? I mean, do they always? That seems to be a key place where that might be a problem. Go ahead.
The short answer is no, that's not always the case. And I'll preface what I'm saying with, I'm a firm believer in Chris Seipel, in his work on covenantal pluralism, talks about the need for self-critique in this world, the self-critique of where we're coming from, and being able to see that as a positive outcome and demonstration of religious freedom. So, cards on the table, my world of interreligious relations, that's my job, isn't very good at gender diversity. That's probably an understatement. And the need for intention around that, that's certainly something that I've committed to. My boss, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is committed to. So when we convene faith leaders, we've got this shorthand in our world of faith actors, so it's not necessarily faith leaders, though as I was saying yesterday, we are effectively talking about leaders because it's women who really are taking the lead in many communities. But we need to create intentional spaces there, and we've not always done so. But as I think Catherine said earlier, it's not simply a matter of the granular, the local. We need both alongside each other. So in this, we do need the symbolism, the centres of teaching that do provide cultural influence for many communities to speak and be at the table. But to do that at the expense of and without those local and national transformative community leaders, we will be failing. So it's trying to hold those together. There's a need for the top down and the bottom up. And again, this is a heuristic endeavor. In Veer, on the way, we will aspire to freedoms and dignity for all.
Thank you very much, Richard. Last question for Mahan. Very quickly, in many ways you were riffing on Professor Ferrari's paradox of the fact that centering religious freedom may actually harm the cause of religious freedom. In 1 minute, could you give a concrete example of that?
1 minute.
1 minute.
1 minute. Let me just quickly say, I agree with Brett and others, but all I'm saying is that religious freedom and dignity, I think it's better that they're an end point rather than the starting point. So it's a methodological question. I'll give you an example. Take Pakistan. We've been talking about Pakistan. Blasphemy laws. I was a mile away when Salman Taseer was assassinated because he spoke up and said, we need to rethink these blasphemy laws. And, we come in and it's like, whoa, it's all about religious freedom and religious liberty here. This is a huge problem. But I'm just going to try and help us understand from the other end. Here's this person. We're in the middle of the war on terror. A lot of us are getting killed over there. And there are people here who say, or here in the United States, we're happy that they're dying over there rather than here. Just the rhetoric. And so now you come in, religious liberty, and what they're saying is, now you want to blaspheme our prophet too? Is that what you're coming in for, after all these bombs? And so we need to work the problem. And so we start not with the end point, but with a starting point, what's the problem here? And that requires a lot of self-critique on all sides. On all sides. I could give you several examples, but I'll stop.
Very good example. I think we have 5 minutes to ask a couple questions. We don't have time to get everybody to respond again. 10 minutes. But I'd like to get just a few more voices into the conversation, and then if there's a few quick responses, we can do that. Yes, the gentleman over here. Please do identify yourself.
My name is Salam Sarhan, and I'm the founder of PPUR International in this field. I would love to echo every word said by the panel, by the other panels, and all what's crossing our mind. But it seems to be like we have 1,000 approach, 1,000 thousands of or millions of effort. But all this need a rule of law, need a as simple as the taxation laws, as simple as the traffic and parking laws, as simple as the stealing rules. It needs an international treaty. We all know that the common denominator of all what we are saying is that we don't want anyone to use religion to undermine equality or discriminate in rights and duty or exclude anyone or restrict anyone from freedom of religion and belief. That's all. This all can be legislated in an international treaty. Not, we have 60, 70 declarations and we have covenant. You are saying that there is 100. That's a proof that they are not working. So we need an international treaty, and this is not a lofty, dreamful thought. There is a global campaign that has a motion for resolution in the Council of Europe, has support and engagement with the government of most of the people here, and we love to talk to anyone. Most of you, I have met you in other conferences and things and that. So there is an international treaty to ban the political use of religion that undermine equality, discriminate in rights and duty, and religious exclusion, and freedom of religion and belief. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A couple more, yes. And please make the comments brief and identify yourself. Thank you. Questions versus comments.
Thank you for all your presentation. I have a question to you, Peter Mandaville. So I really appreciated that you have this policy approaches on different countries. You mentioned the examples, especially in the global south. Sorry, I'm a little bit excited. So you said Myanmar, Indonesia, and Iraq. So my question is, are you also looking at the global north? So because we have religious communities which are also discriminated in the global north, like Muslim communities which are not recognized by the liberal secular state, and they also need religious freedom and the right of religious freedom. So my impression was that we focus very much on the global south when it comes to human development, looking on developing countries, but I suggest that we also have to look on the global north. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neval. Thank you. Very good question. One more question, Cora, in the back. And then if there are a couple people who want to respond.
Thank you. Cora Alder from LSE. I also have a question for Peter, but by extension to the panel. So we've heard today and also yesterday about USAID's approach to localization. And as you know from your previous life as an academic, localization has been criticized for maybe the past 10 years in academia, starting with the question who gets to define the local, but also kind of international actors reinforcing local elites or reinforcing local power dynamics, or only working with actors who are mirroring Western values, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering if there was any kind of critical reflection on localization at USID or in the wider space of FORB on who is the local, what local do we work with?
All right, thanks very much. For time's sake, we're going to let Peter answer one or two of those, and if somebody has a burning last minute, they can, but otherwise we'll stop there. Go ahead, Peter.
So thank you very much for the question. That of course, importantly reminds us that these kinds of challenges are not present only in what we sometimes call the global south. They're present in my own country, in the United States as well. They're certainly present throughout many countries in Europe. Given, if I could say, the mandate and jurisdiction of my agency, we do our work primarily through countries in which we have missions, which are institutionally separate, although often embedded within U.S. embassies in those countries. And so our work work proceeds, through, our work is focused on those countries where we have that kind of presence, which tend to be, given that our focus is on countries that fall within a certain income category, tend to be countries in the global south. That doesn't mean to say, however, that the United States government is not aware of and engaged on these issues in some of the countries you mentioned. That work tends to be done through the global human rights programming resources that are done by our partners over at the State Department. So I hope that answers your question. And I'll just add specifically that some of that work has focused directly on issues of, for example, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment, and anti-Semitism in Western Europe in recent years. To Cora, your question, I want to first clarify that there's no claim here that localization is anything new, right? We've been having some version of the development needs to become more localized debate since the 1990s, right? Since people first started criticizing the idea that you could take, programmatic templates designed at the World Bank or USAID headquarters and just kind of drop them in any country and expect things to work out, that we need to figure out how to make sure that those programs, that the understanding of theories of change, if you can put it that way, that lie behind them are attuned to and informed by local needs, local experiences. So I'll be the first to admit that we're still assessing to what extent this is working. What I'm suggesting is that this administration has been far more systematic and intentional in trying to take the jargon, the often easy jargon of localization, and say, no, it needs to be reflected and operationalized in these three specific ways. There are ongoing debates we have of the sort that you referenced about what counts as local. So just one quick example of how that plays out. I mentioned already an organization like Catholic Relief Services. Catholic Relief Services is at one level a huge, enormous international nonprofit headquartered in Baltimore in the United States. There are local Catholic Relief Services affiliates and country offices around the world. When USAID gives money directly to a Catholic Relief Services affiliate, does that count as part of diverting funding towards local actors or not, given the fact that it's part of a sort of holding company, as it were, that has this global persona? So it's those kinds of issues that we're quite openly reflecting on and debating, often in direct contact with some of our academic interlocutors and critics and their counterparts within these very organizations that I'm talking about.
Thank you very much, Peter. Does anyone have a burning 30-second last reflection before we close? Sharon.
Many countries do not even uphold their own national laws, let alone an international treaty. Doesn't mean that because you have international treaties or local laws that they're upheld or implemented in any way. That's a very big problem.
Thank you very much. Last 30 seconds. Just wanted to speak to the question of that there's a text out there that will suddenly answer all our problems. We're messy human beings, and this is why relationship is key. This is why both the global and the local are absolutely necessary. So we won't have salvation in a new set of words, although that would be lovely if that were the case.
And that might be a nice way to end this session. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much.